Welcome to Fractional Frequency, our take on talent, people trends, and the reality of building up businesses in an economy that keeps rewriting the rules. I'm Amy Crook, founder of Stratavis.
And I'm Erin Totis, Managing Director of Talent Delivery, which basically means I live in the universe of finding the right people to make an impact for our clients fast.
Around here, we talk about the real side of HR and talent, what works, what absolutely doesn't, and how to build teams that can carry a business, not drag it down.
We'll break down trends, share the behind the scenes of scaling a consultancy from zero, and probably overshare a little because that's where the good lessons live.
So whether you're building, hiring, leading, or just trying to keep your company profitable, you're in the right place.
This is Fractional Frequency. Let's get to it.
Hello.
Hi, how's it going?
Going good, going good. How about yourself?
It's been a great day. It's flown by like many of them do.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. Well, I'm super excited today. Today, joining us as part of our homage to women in leadership this month, we have one of my all-time favorite people. She's a strategic communications leader with over 15 years of experience in building programs that cultivate engagement and connect the dots for global organizations. She brings a lot of heart to her work and is passionate about using communications as a real catalyst for change. She's currently the Director of Communications at Baker Donelson. Welcome, Nponano Maikori.
Hello. Hi, ladies.
Hello.
Welcome.
Yeah,
I'm
I'm excited to
so
be here. Thank
I'm
you.
so happy that you're here. I really am. Like, you are always one of my favorite people to speak to. Always hilarious, always in the know. I love it.
Oh,
Um,
stop.
so let's start by talking through your career journey. When did you know that a career in communications was the right fit for you?
When I got burned out on radio. So, I don't think that it was ever something that I thought about until I needed to find something other than what I had been doing. And so, I worked in broadcast journalism for 7 years after college. And it was one of those things where I just always envisioned myself in that space. And I remember an advisor when I was in college telling me that while radio and media at that time would be fun for the moment. He was, very, very emphatic about the fact that they didn't pay well.
Mm,
And 7 years in, I was teetering between, do I want to continue being poor or do I just want to be able to enjoy free concerts, free promotions, and all of the things that come with working at a radio station? And so obviously I chose the aforementioned because being poor at that point was starting to be kind of like a lifestyle struggle for me. I hated it.
Mm, feel that for sure. Um, and what early experiences, Panana, would you say shaped how you think about influence and communication as you were sort of finding yourself on that journey?
Yeah, I didn't start my career, like I just said, thinking about corporate communications at all. And it was kind of one of those things where I do think that the background in journalism and broadcasting really helped shape everything that I was trained for moving forward. I was trained to chase headlines. And I think over time, what happened is I became more interested in what happened before the headline and before that story, because it's not just what's happening, it's what people understand about what's happening. And so I think the journalism taught me two critical things. First, that information was power. And
mm,
second, that framing is also power.
mm,
Two people could report the same exact story, same facts, and shape completely different reactions based on how they choose to sequence it or the tone that they use or the things that they emphasize. And so when I moved into corporate environments, I think what I really figured out, especially in male dominated spaces, I
mm,
noticed that, something else was just as important. It's one of those things where oftentimes the loudest voice is what gets credited as being the smartest voice.
Mm,
And that wasn't always true,
yeah.
right? I became fascinated with how to gain influence that didn't require me being loud. I grew up in a family full of Nigerians. And so oftentimes you had to shout over one another to have people hear you. And I saw that in that corporate setting. And, it was just really fascinating to me. And it's just kind of like, I don't want to always be the loudest person in the room.
Yeah.
And so it also taught me that fact alone does not move people, right? Feeling does, because there have been a lot of instances where we've shared facts and still had, abysmal result or outcome to it. And so I think you can always give accurate information, but if you ignore how it lands emotionally,
Yeah.
then you lose the room. So for me, communication became less about broadcasting and more about translation, right? Strategy only works if people understand it, and understanding requires clarity, it requires context, but most importantly, it requires emotional calibration. And so for me, I think that's when I realized that I didn't need to be the headline when I could shape the headline.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I wonder, like just listening to you talk about that journey of your growth, how did your definition of success evolve as kind of your influencing ability grew?
Yeah, I mean, I think early on in my career, success really looked like visibility, right? I think that's what most people would equate it to. What's your title? How much time do you have in front of leadership? Like, how much
Mm,
of the floor are you given? Because I think recognition often feels like proof of value for people.
yeah.
But I think success looks like a number of different things. For me in my role, it looks like alignment. It looks like fewer surprises. It
Mm,
looks like executives who aren't feeling blindsided, employees who feel informed without, you know, having to try too hard to get that information. I
yeah.
used to equate recognition with value like most people. And I think now I equate consistency with value,
Uh,
because sustainable leadership isn't about being impressive. It's really about being dependable. And so if
mm,
leaders communicate with clarity and confidence because of work we did behind the scenes, for me, that's success. Like if trust increases, like even when the decisions are hard, that's success.
yeah.
Comms in particular, internal, it's not sexy. So people don't like paying attention to it. And that's a gift for me. And I never see it as a curse, unless I'm working with a leader or leaders who just really don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I don't know about that. I've experienced your internal communications and they were pretty hot. I enjoyed them.
Yeah, thank you.
What misconceptions, and you kind of touched on this a little bit with that comment actually, like what misconceptions do people have about like corporate communications leadership?
Well, I would say internally, I think the biggest misconception, and trust me, there are plenty of them, but I would say it's that we're mostly tactical, right? I think most people think of comms and they're like, oh, they send emails or they polish language after decisions are already made. But I think for many corp comms leaders, unfortunately, that is actually the case, right?
Mm,
But I would say in reality that corporate communications, I liken it to organizational psychology at scale. I think it's risk management, it's stakeholder mapping, it's scenario planning, it's culture temperature checks. I think it's executive coaching at really high stakes moments. It's a
yeah,
lot of really important things, but I think in its purest form, it's really essentially about truth telling. It's deeply human work and it's not made for everybody, right? I often say that comms is part science, part soul.
yeah,
The science part of it, right? It's the structure, it's the sequencing of information, it's anticipating reactions from your key stakeholders, from your audience. It's about measuring sentiment, not just engagement. It's how like we understand ambiguity increases anxiety and how
mm,
clarity will always reduce that, right? And so for me, the soul part of it, it's the emotional calibration I was just talking about. It's knowing when people need data and when they really just want acknowledgement. It's helping leaders sound like themselves and not sound like me. Reading the temperature of an organization and adjusting the tone in our messaging accordingly, right? So it's a
yeah,
number of different things. And I think, regardless of what you think is the most important aspect of comms work, the bottom line is that you have to have both. Because if you have science without soul, then you get sterile messaging that technically says the right thing, but doesn't necessarily land with your audience. But
yeah,
if you have soul without science, then it's like you get warmth and pleasantness without structure, but it causes confusion.
yeah.
So, I heard another comms leader say, not too long ago that like communications is data informed and emotion aware. And
Mm,
I was like, that's so beautiful because you have to have both to move people. And so, I think for communicators, we're really fortunate to sit at this intersection of what's true and what's strategic and what people can emotionally handle. But I think yet and still, right, we're often the last function invited into strategy conversations, but the first ones to get blamed when alignment fails. So it's like when it's working, nothing looks dramatic, right? And ultimately that's the point, but that doesn't mean that it's not irritating.
right.
I love that you keep referring, Panano, to just moving people. There's so much power in how you frame information and how people receive that, that get them
Hmm.
not just to digest it, but to actually act on it in the way that an organization is maybe hoping for them to. And I think it's just incredible the work that you do. I want to shift the conversation a little bit here. And we've talked about your journey and about recognition and visible milestones, but I'm always more interested in the moves that don't necessarily make the bio or the
Hmm.
headlines, like you mentioned earlier. And so, some of the subtle decisions or actions that really quietly build authority and shift outcomes inside of an organization in a big way. And so my first question to you is to maybe share an example or two of a power move that looks quiet on the surface, but shifts everything behind the scenes when done right.
Yeah, I mean, I think for communications, right, quiet power moves are usually about like sequencing and tone and timing. They don't look dramatic, but they're fundamentally like they change the outcomes of your comms. For example, I've been in situations where leadership wanted to announce a big shift really quickly because speed to them felt like decisiveness. But when you're close to the emotional temperature of your organization, what you realize is that speed is going to feel destabilizing. In one case, we paused the launch for 48 hours, and that pause allowed me the opportunity to pre-brief some of our senior leaders, and then anticipate what some of the tough questions would be once we rolled it out. And then we could adjust language that unintentionally sounded dismissive. And then when the message went out, it landed really calmly. There was no backlash, there were no fire drills, just thoughtful engagement.
Mm,
I think another quiet power move is changing the order of a message. Like I reviewed a draft not too long ago that led with performance metrics and strategic next steps, like after a really hard quarter. It
mm,
was accurate, right? But it emotionally felt super tone deaf. So we resequenced it to acknowledge the fatigue and the uncertainty first.
mm,
Then we moved into the direction. And I think it was the same facts, but just adjusting the order. That small change really completely led to a different reception, I think, that had we led with the previous way. And so sometimes the power move is choosing not to amplify something, right? Not every internal frustration deserves a megaphone. Sometimes stabilizing energy really requires restraint. And I think one of the most underrated power moves for me has always been preparation. I
mm,
think for me, when I have to think three moves ahead, I'm at my best. So asking how will this land with our frontline teams, with our managers, with our global audience, that invisible anticipation, I think, prevents visible chaos, right? And it's like I'd like to think that preventing drama in any form has to be a power of some sort.
mm.
Wow. No, that's so interesting, helping to kind of almost see around corners, it seems like in those contexts. And you mentioned earlier, Panano, that sometimes it feels like in corporate communications, while the function is so critical and can have so much impact to how a message lands, that sometimes you're the last to be invited into the conversation.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, how can people build influence without positional authority?
Become useful. Like I can't I don't know that there's a sexier way of saying that. Just become useful and then do it consistently. I
Mm,
think early in my career, I didn't really have the biggest title in the room, but I could anticipate people's reactions. And so
mm,
that helped me because then I could sharpen language. I could ask the question that no one else considered yet, or the
mm,
question that a lot of people were afraid to ask, right? There were moments when I'd walk into a meeting and intentionally not speak first, just to listen for what was being said, and then if you offer a reframing like, oh, I think the employees are going to hear when we say that this is X, is that our intent? Because what that does is it shifts the conversation without confrontation, right? And
Mm,
so for me, influence builds when you are consistently making other people look steady and
mm,
thoughtful, not good, steady and thoughtful.
mhm,
Also, I think confidentiality and trust builds influence, especially in my work, right? If leaders trust that you won't leak a draft or you won't gossip or weaponize information that they know could potentially be an issue, then they're more comfortable bringing you into bigger rooms.
yeah.
I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is trying to prove that they're influential because it's like real influence, it's observed. You
Mhm.
don't have to tell people that you're influential. And it grows when people realize that you increase clarity at the same time reducing risk. So for me, being in the room isn't influential, improving the room is.
Mm, I
Mm,
love that.
yeah. And so you're at this point in your career, especially, you've been in a number of high stakes rooms and high stakes conversations. Tell us a little bit about how you protect credibility in high pressure or high visibility moments within organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it, again, is it ties back to a lot of what I've really touched on in terms of like building that trust. But I mean, I think it's really simple, right? Credibility is built before you need it. Like you can't wait until you're in one of those high pressure moments and then start scrambling to, come up with examples or scenarios of ways that you've added value, right? And so it's just like you need it before like you build it before you need it so that you can leverage it once you actually have it. I think transparency in that instance, it has to be a muscle because if you only communicate during good times, then you're never going to be trusted during the hard ones.
Mm,
And in high pressure moments, like, I focus on saying what we know, saying what we don't know, and then also being able and comfortable to acknowledge that when we know more, we'll share it. I think a lot of times leaders don't want to present as if they're uncertain about any of it. And sometimes I don't know, honestly, goes a long way.
yeah.
And so I think like avoiding exaggeration and getting your leaders aligned before messaging ever happens is also something that's really critical. I think, if you're just drafting a message before everyone is on the same page, think about how many drafts you would go through as you're making tweaks because people are now offering different perspectives and insight as opposed to if you would have just taken the time to start that alignment on
Mm,
the front end, right? And then for me, I think honestly, just being able to anticipate reaction in advance um, is is another power because I think a lot of times people are more apt to just get out whatever the communication or the messaging is without really thinking about how it's going to land.
mhm.
And that's doing yourself a disservice in most instances, because if you're not able to anticipate the reactions in advance, then you're shooting yourself in the foot from a credibility perspective.
Yeah.
Totally. And you mentioned earlier a little bit about the power of listening and sometimes not always being the first to open your mouth in a room,
Hmm.
but to really
Hmm.
absorb and get a pulse before offering your perspective. And so, sort of along that thread, when would you say is silence maybe more powerful than speaking?
Mm. Whew. I think um, silence is more powerful than speaking when you're reacting emotionally instead of strategically.
Mm,
Mm,
Um, I think there's a difference between responsiveness and reactivity. And strategic silence gives you the space to gather the facts and the information that you need, right? It gives you the space to observe emotional patterns. And it gives you the space to prevent escalation, where I think a lot of people would see silence as avoidance. It really isn't. It's discipline. Because in volatile moments, calm is really the biggest influence you possibly could have.
I
yeah.
love that. Love that. All right, I've got a couple of really real questions for you, Panano,
Uh-huh.
if you're good to shift gears a little bit.
Yeah.
So the first may hit home. Do organizations, in your opinion, undervalue communications until there's a crisis?
So this is one of those ones that I think most communicators are, would probably err towards the side of hell yeah. But I mean, for me, I don't think that organizations ignore communications until there's a crisis, but a crisis definitely exposes whether comms has been treated as a strategic partner or an afterthought, right? And I think that a lot of organizations don't hold that mirror up to themselves until it's too late. Because when things are calm, good communication tends to blend into the background, right? You almost don't notice it because it's working so well. And
Yeah.
that's great. But the minute something unexpected happens is when everyone suddenly realizes how essential it is to have clear messages and aligned leaders and some kind of a plan, because then they're beating your door down like, what are we going to do? And it's just like, oh, you remember that I work here. That's great. So it's like I like to say that crisis comms is really just the stress test for everyday communications. Because if you're
Mhm.
invested in building trust and clarity and good communication habits early, then your organization is going to weather any tough moment no matter what, right? And you're always going to be better for it. But if you haven't, well, then the crisis will make the obvious really quickly. It will make that obvious really quickly, right? So for me, it's less about organizations not prioritizing comms and more about helping leaders see the value before the fire drill starts. Because when you bake communications into your culture, not just into your crisis plan, you make everything stronger. And I think that I've had the immense pleasure of being in organizations over the last, several roles that I've been in that really understand the importance of it before the shit hits the fan, if I can say shit.
Yeah, you
You
can.
can.
Like, you totally can. And it's so true. And it almost makes me think about just a more general principle in leadership around, you know, the strength of a person is demonstrated when there is a crisis, but if you haven't done
Mm-hmm.
the work when things are going well, to build that
Mm-hmm.
credibility and to build that relationship, then you're going to get thrown under the bus because they're
Mm-hmm.
not going to trust you. So I think that's
100%.
a huge lesson for anyone listening who's navigating a corporate landscape that, building the credibility and the trust when things are good is important. You've got to show like your value, and sometimes that's quiet,
Yep.
and that's okay. So I
You
think
know what's funny about that, Amy? I think a lot of people when you start, and I'm seeing it now as I'm stepping into this new role and I'm meeting with different stakeholders and different people around the organization,
yeah.
people have a really hard time feeling like they're bragging about themselves. And I'm like, you know what? You better learn how to gloat with the best of them. Otherwise, your position is going to be eliminated with the quickness. Like, you have to learn how to tell the story of the work that you do better than anybody else in that organization. Because once you realize that a lot of times you're on an island
Yeah.
and no one knows what you're doing. So you have to get out there and you have to toot your own horn. And I know that that's something that's extremely hard, especially for professionals who consider themselves to be like humble people. It's like, yeah,
Mhm.
this is the one time in your life where I'd say you better find that new gear
Yeah.
and be braggadocious as possible.
100%, 100%. And this time more than ever, you have to be able to demonstrate your value and believe that. I just did a post on this earlier, actually, about, your brand in an organization. Are you showing up with a
Mm-hmm.
point of view? Are you, being proactive with your communications to deliver insights
Mm-hmm.
and information? Like, this is really important right now. Otherwise, yeah, you're right. Like, if you're just, doing, a very it's simple A to B execution without that consultative or insightful piece, then people aren't going to realize what you're bringing to the table. So it's a really important message for people to take when they're navigating their careers, that you have to find a way to get comfortable with promoting what you're doing.
100%.
Well, I think we actually answered both of the tension questions with that, so that's awesome. So I am going to take us to our closing questions, which are just designed to be quick fire, but if we get on a tangent, that's okay. We're flexible around here. What do you believe is one invisible power move that more leaders should master?
Um, Preparation is the spice of life. I
Mm,
mean, I think preparation communicates respect. If you've thought 3 moves ahead and you've anticipated reactions and you've mapped out consequences, then I guarantee you people will take notice and they'll feel it.
yeah. I agree. I agree. They'll feel more steady and more comfortable. I know that that's a word that you've used kind of throughout this conversation, and I don't think you can underestimate as a leader, like being steady is so important for those around you. Being consistent is so important.
Oh yeah, we've all worked around crazy, erratic leaders, and
Yeah.
it begets crazy, erratic cultures, right? And so
Yes.
it's one of those things where, people, especially if you're someone with influence, people feed off of your energy. And so
Mhm.
I can't over communicate how important, you just said it, steadiness really is.
Yeah. So we just kind of mentioned influence. I'm curious, like, what do you think is one mistake that professionals make when trying to build influence in their organization?
Um, I think confusing proximity to power with actual influence. Being in the room isn't the same as being able to shape the outcome.
Mhm.
I've been in plenty of rooms with, people who are next to the CEO or the COO or the, chief technology officer and thought that because that they had their ear, that would translate to them being able to influence an outcome in a different
Mhm.
meeting or scenario with other stakeholders. And that just turned out to not be the case. And
Yeah.
so I think that, you can run around and you can use that proximity that you have to leadership as a way of getting people to listen, but not necessarily getting people to act.
Mm. Yes. Yeah, there's such a big difference between the two. Like if you want people to follow you, you have to put the time in.
For sure.
Okay. And my last question, what is one action that leaders can take tomorrow to strengthen the trust and help to control the narrative of their teams?
Um, I would say ask them what feels unclear right now.
Mm,
And then close that loop, right? Because clarity is the currency of trust.
yeah.
And, trust helps build influence. And so I think that if you're, showing an interest in fixing or solving something that is a challenge for them right now,
Mhm.
that's the quickest, easiest win that you could possibly have.
I love it. All these pearls of wisdom. I've got so many new catchphrases that I'm just going to drop into conversation
Yeah.
after this call. It has been so fun to talk to you again, Panano, and I know that Erin feels the same way. You are always just so insightful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to connect with us today.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, thank you for having me. I think that if there's two better people to get leadership and development advice from, it's the two of you. I hope that
Mm.
organizations are really taking the time to let you all help come and build out really an impactful culture for them. I think that it's one of those things where in today's day and age, it's more important than ever. And there's not a lot of great resources out there, and you two are a great resource. So I hope people are taking advantage of it.
Oh, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you so much. Well, we will be sure to speak to you soon. Keep in touch, and thanks so much again for joining us.
Thanks, ladies. Have a great one.
You too.